It's great to be here. I hope I don't repeat too much of what you've already heard. Definitely doing a 2.5-hour class on pastoral counseling is challenging. I tell you what, for me, public speaking is a lot like diving. It's my, diving in swimming pools. I experience it the same way. When I used to be into diving, and I always get up on the platform, and I definitely knew what I wanted to accomplish, right? I had a vision of what I was going to do, and then for me, I would just go off the end and nothing. It was like a big blank, and then I hit the water. So I either fell the right way or flat on my back or flat on my stomach. And I would ask a friend or coach, okay, what did I do wrong? And they say, well, what you need to do is when you get up there, you go up first and you pull your knees up. And then when your knees are up, you throw your head back. And then when you see the water, you extend. And I was like, you don't understand. Once I get up there, I'm not aware of what happens next. And that's how when I speak, same kind of thing. You have an outline, you have an idea of what you want to accomplish. You want to be a little spectacular while you're at it. And you just kind of go for it. And the next thing you know, it's over. And you go, I don't know if I covered what I wanted to cover. So anyway, I have a lot to go through. I am a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing for 21 years. I got my PhD from Louisiana State University. Before that, I had an undergraduate degree in biblical languages, Greek and Hebrew, from Harding University, home of the mighty bison. And then I finished up my studies at Brown, where I did my internship. And so I've been in Boston now for 6 years. All right, let's see if I can get this thing working. Huh? Maybe not. Maybe the old Mac interface may not work with... that's going to be a nuisance. Okay. I don't think... is this only for Mac? For a PC, do you think? It's only PC friendly?
I just think it's for normal computers.
Normal computers?
I'm sorry if that's...
No, that's fine.
You're pushing the page down.
Yeah, right. Page down, right? Yeah, it's not working. We'll try. Sorry about the technical glitch here.
Let me try on this side.
Okay, anyway, what I'd like to do is, the first hour I'd like to talk a little bit about just a general overview of principles of pastoral counseling that I think are important for any disciple, any minister, just to understand people, how to help them. And mostly what I hope to present is kind of a way to think about people, a way to think about your role. And hopefully you got the handout. I had a handout I sent down. Right? No? No handout? I emailed it. No, that's okay. All right. No, we should be able to get you a copy at some point. I have all my notes. So anyway, so just a way to think about people, how to help them, about your role. And then the second hour, I'd like to actually walk through kind of putting it all together with maybe an example like depression and show you how you can use all this. So this is going to be challenging. So, to help people, there's 3 things that I feel like we need on just my nice little graphics there. One is you need what I call a viable working model. You have to have a model of how people work, how they're made, and you've obviously covered some of that in the last couple of days. You also have to have a healthy relationship with people. To me, counseling, one of the greatest things about it is just it's the relationship aspect. Is that I feel like for the last 21 years, people have literally invited me into their lives. And it's phenomenal just to be able to sit with someone, to sit with them a few hours or many hours for a few weeks or maybe a few months, a few years, and really get to know them. And most counselors would agree that the relationship itself and the experience the person has in the relationship is a lot of what's healing. And then the last one I'll talk briefly about today is self-awareness. I feel like to really help others, you've probably all diagnosed yourself by now, right? You all have 3 mood disorders, 2 personality disorders, and a touch of psychosis in there. You start listening to stuff, you go, wow, that sounds like me. That's good, not to diagnose yourself. But what's good is to reflect, because your awareness of yourself will really severely limit or enhance how you help other people. Really, the degree to which you understand yourself will have a big impact on how much you understand other people. But vice versa. You learn a lot about yourself. There's been times, maybe I'm a little bit too egocentric, but there's been times I've sat, through a week of appointments And at the end of the week, I think, I don't know if I helped anybody this week, but I sure learned a lot about myself. Hopefully you're helping people along the way. Anyway, like I said, people are complex. That Psalm 139:14, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. We are complicated, but luckily there are simple things that do help and that do work. So I want to talk first about, I'm just going to put these at once. What do I mean by a viable working model? Well, I think when it comes to thinking about people and thinking about your role in trying to help people and counseling people, I think your model needs to be biblically sound, it needs to be scientifically sound, and it needs to be practical or practically useful. The biblically sound one, I want to spend a little time talking about that because that may seem really obvious to you. I'm just going to put my whole slides up here because this is all in the notes. And I won't have to move around so much. A biblically sound model. What I feel like one of the biggest challenges, even in Christian counseling, as you read a lot of Christian counseling materials, and as a lot of Christians go into the field of counseling, is I feel like one of the things that can happen is actually a lot of the world creeps on in. And a lot of times it's in more subtle ways. It's not super obvious ways. So I just want to talk about three of them right now, three influences that I think are very problematic. One of them is individualism. You've heard about it, but individualism is one of the hallmark traits of America and certainly of Western society. And it's the idea that really it's about me, that it begins with me and it ends with me. And there's no doubt that in evangelical Christianity that has just come full force in. That we tend to think of our relationship with God, that it begins and ends with my salvation and my personal relationship with God. And a lot of people's distress even sometimes comes from, how could God do this to me? And individualism is something you'll have to be very tuned into, because as a counselor, you can actually play right into that. You can actually just be part of that. Let's sit together for countless hours and just talk about you, without bringing them in to the bigger picture, which we'll talk about in a minute, of God's story. And I think counseling is worthless if it just keeps people locked in on themselves. Now, some people never think about themselves and need to stop and reflect. So I'm not saying ignore yourself, but that it can't be all about beginning and ending with the individual. The expert culture. That's probably one of my greatest disappointments of how the expert trap has bled into the church. Now, when I first became part of the movement in the early 80s. It was actually in Atlanta. I came to a Christian Professionals Conference. It must have been 1983. I don't know. It was way back. But I was getting my PhD in psychology. And those were the early days of the movement when psychology was evil, part of the dark empire. And I remember we were at the Lennox building or something. And everybody introduced, hey, I'm so-and-so. I'm a lawyer. I'm so-and-so. I'm a businessman. I'm so-and-so. And I was like, hey, I'm David MacAnulty. I'm studying to become a clinical psychologist. And it'd be like, you could hear the synapses like you mean you were studying psychology and now you're not? No, I'm studying it right now. And are you a Christian? Yeah. Are you one of us? I was like, yes, actually I am. But there were those days when we thought that psychology was evil. But we can swing to the other extreme where we really feel like you have to be an expert and we need experts for everything. Society is really broken down God's vision of a healing community. And I think as a counselor, or a lot of you aren't going to become professional counselors, but you can be a voice that brings that back. That the wisdom, the family sense of a community can be very healing. And God had an idea that the older would help the younger. And our society segments everybody out. All the singles together, all the teens together, all the college kids together, all the marrieds with kids together. And we segment out and we bring that right into the church. And it kind of breaks down God's view of a community. He goes, well, no, I want the singles to help the families with their kids. I want the older to help the younger. And so we'll get into his great vision of that. But one of the drawbacks of the expert culture is that you start trusting training more than wisdom. And the Bible talks a lot about wisdom. And training, if it gives you wisdom, is awesome. But training can never replace wisdom. And so God is about wisdom. So hopefully what you're learning these days is helping make you wiser. But if you want to become an expert, and that's your ultimate goal, remember that God's interested in you being wise. The other drawback of the expert culture is that it emphasizes skills much more than example. I mean, you know the cliche, right? And it's truth to that cliche that most therapists go into the field of therapy to sort themselves out. There's a lot of truth to that. I'm the only exception, actually. But the reality is you can, as an expert, help people. I mean, I've seen counselors who really helped other people in their marriages, but were on their third marriage themselves. So you go, well, yeah, with skills you can do that. But there's something not quite biblical about that, right? Yeah. There's something biblical about, well, it should be something you're living. It should be something. So I think we have to be careful not to overvalue skills too much, although they are important. The last one, therapeutic culture. No, same slide. Therapeutic culture. I mean, obviously we're in a time when the most important thing to us is our happiness. And I think that that's bled into the church as well. I've sat with so many couples who are just despairing, I mean, beyond despair. They've been Christians 15 years, they've been married 12 years in the church, and they're like hopeless. I mean, they're like flat as a doornail in terms of their hope. Because what they thought is they thought I'd come into the church and I'd be guaranteed a happy marriage. And I'd find a spouse who would make me happy. But see the fundamental flaw, it is true that following the Bible, living the Christian life gives you a leg up, so to speak, on people in the world. But see, it's not about happiness. That was never God's ultimate plan for us. He had a much bigger plan for us. Now, it's not that He wants us to be unhappy, but He had something bigger in mind. And when it comes to parenting, a lot of us I want to know what's the trick for my kids to turn out right. And God goes, well, I'm trying to shape the whole of you. I'm not just interested in... And so I think that the therapeutic culture has definitely led to people thinking it's all about me, my well-being, and my happiness. And there's a fundamental clash between medicine and psychology on the one hand, and biblical spirituality on the other hand. And the fundamental clash is this, is that in psychology and in medicine, our goal is always, always, always to alleviate suffering. And if we read our Bible, God's goal is sometimes to take you right into the middle of suffering. And so, I'm not going to say suffering is good and we shouldn't try to help each other. Obviously, I've devoted my life to being a counselor to help people with their suffering. But we can't look past that. That for God, sometimes He leads you right into suffering. And that's a fundamental difference. So let me talk a little bit about the biblical answers. Now, same slide. Biblical answers. The answer to individualism is just tuning into God's story. Let's read a couple scriptures. Genesis chapter 12. The two things I want to talk about under this are just the idea of covenant. We won't cover it in depth. Genesis 12. Verse 2. God telling Abraham, obviously, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And 1 Peter 2, this would be the New Testament version of the same covenant kind of promise and covenant announcement. 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you know the verse. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. You see, in contrast to individualism, where it begins and ends with you, you have the biblical view that God's always wanted a covenant community, a family of believers, of followers, and that through that family, even His goal wasn't just, and Israel misunderstood that, His goal wasn't just to make them happy and well. He said, I want you to be a blessing to those outside. And so in 1 Peter 2, you'll be my people so that what? You may declare the praises of Him who called you. So on the one hand, you have the individualism of the world. On the other hand, in the Bible, you have God looking at, well, no, even my covenant with you is so it'll bless many others. And so as you sit with somebody counseling, you're always remembering that in the back of your mind. That I want to help you. I want to help you overcome depression. I want to help you overcome anxiety. I want to help you in your marriage. But this is part of a much bigger story than just you and me. It's part of a much bigger story that good God is trying to do good outside of our little sphere. And that just helps us keep things on straight with our perspective. The other piece of God's story that I think is important would be in Romans 8. So one is covenant, the other one, I don't know, I'd call it creation theology. But in Romans 8, read a couple scriptures here. Verse 18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. You know, this is a passage that gives a great picture. And I feel like as we help people, we have to keep the big picture in mind. That he says, you know, this place is temporary. And our sorrows are temporary. But we are groaning. But all of creation looks to us. And they're looking to find hope. Look what he says in Ephesians chapter 3, a very powerful verse. Ephesians 3:10. Speaking of God, his intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. Man, that's amazing. He says that his intent is that his wisdom would be made known through whom? Through the church. So what does all this have to do with counseling? It gives you a bigger context. When I sit with you to try to help you, I'm not an expert who's got a lot of skills, who's going to help you reach your individual happiness so life can go well with you. That's way too small of a picture. What I'm doing is God has invited me. God has given me the privilege to be a brother to you. And to sit with you, to listen, to try to understand you, to walk with you, to try through whatever training I have, whatever experiences I have, to walk with you, to take you before God, to help you gain wisdom, to help you feel comforted, to help you feel encouraged, feel hope, and that relationship is part of even a bigger picture, so that through that, the manifold wisdom of God is made known in this world and in the other world, the spiritual world. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. See, you know, I hope I'm not talking too obscurely, but after 20 years of counseling, that's the thing that I feel is the most needed, is you have to see that what you're doing is part of something much bigger. Amen. Because that's where the power comes from. Come on, Dave. I was sitting with a couple just the other day. And I'd met with them 3 times, I think, so far. And after the second session, I gave them some suggestions, things they could work on. And we worked it out together. They kind of knew what they needed to work on, and we talked about it, some practicals. And they came back to the third session, and I said, well, how did it go? Well, neither one really did any of the things they said they were going to do. So I said, well, kind of what happened. And whatever the words were, the message basically was, well, I know what I should do, but I guess I was just selfish and I didn't do it. And so I just listened and I said, you know what? That's not compelling at all. I wouldn't do it either if I were you. I should do it. So what's compelling about I should do it? When you get into the tough parts of life, like really working on your character at a deep, deep level, which is what it's going to take to make your marriage work, the should do it is not compelling enough. And so we actually spent an hour just even talking about God's vision of marriage. And that it's not just about 2 people being happy, but it's about really blessing the children, their children after them, blessing the community, that it's actually part of proclaiming the kingdom of God in this world.
Come on.
You see, when we work on a marriage, bumps and all, or when we fight through illness or depression, we're actually proclaiming God's kingdom in some way. When you sit and love somebody who's depressed and say, I will listen to you 1,000 hours if I have to, because I care enough to try to understand you. And to try to understand your experience, and then to try to bring the scriptures to the matter and help you. You are proclaiming God's kingdom in the realms above. They go, wow, wow, love exists. You know, that's what the book of Job is all about. The book of Job is about Satan coming before God and saying, look at your servant Job. I mean, he's talking about whatever. I forget how it starts. But God says, have you considered my servant Job? He goes, yeah, Job, of course he loves you. I mean, you've treated him so well. But you take away his belongings, his family, his marriage, his health, the two different parts, and then he'll curse you. See, what Satan is telling God is, I don't believe in love. I don't believe it transforms people. I don't believe in mercy. I don't believe in grace. I don't believe in covenants. I don't believe in any of that. It doesn't work. People just do what's best for them. And Job doesn't know it, right, till the end of the story. But man, he's fighting a glorious battle. I mean, he's hanging in there going, I have no idea what's happening. What have I done wrong? And his friends are trying to tell him what he's done wrong. And God's like, no, that's not the story at all. We all shut up. The story is, I'm proud of him. Because he's proving that love is real. So, how does that apply to counseling? When we help one another, that's what we're doing. We're saying everything that God wrote in the Bible and everything that Jesus lived out in his life, it's real. It transforms people. And that 2,000 years later, people are trying to live it. They're imperfect, they blow it, but they're really trying to do it. And Satan's up here, the accuser, he goes, no, they're not. You give it. Come on, did y'all learn about borderline personality disorder yesterday? No, it's the diagnosis that nobody wants to treat. Let me put a couple borderlines in the church. You're going to find out these people are not the real deal. They don't accept lepers. They don't take people whose emotions are woo, woo, up and down, conflict, chaos, chronic suicidal behavior. They don't know what to do with them, and they run for the door. And God goes, no, this is my chosen people. They declare my praises. My wisdom is made evident in them. You'll see. They'll pull their hair out, but they'll still love him. They'll run for the experts. What do we do? But they'll hang in there with them. It's glorious. It's amazing. And so, if I want you to catch any vision, it's just to see your role in a much bigger context. Much bigger context. We are proclaiming nothing less than God's kingdom. We don't have to be perfect at it. But that's what we're doing. What's the last one? Obviously, the second one. Storytelling community. That's kind of what I was talking about. Look at Acts 4:32. I mean, this fits right in with that idea, right? Acts 4:32, great passage, picture of the early church. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and much grace was upon them all. There were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone as he had need. You know, on this side, I had a kind of the therapeutic culture, which kind of the whole idea is life is about solving my problems, making me happy, working through my obstacles. I think it would be a big mistake for the church to become primarily a healing community. That's our goal, to heal people. I don't see that in the Bible. Our goal is to glorify God. Yep. Our goal is to proclaim his praises. If we do that, and if we live out this story, and that's why I like the expression storytelling community, if we live out the story of Jesus and how we interact with one another, people will be healed. You see, you have to take all the stories of Jesus. As a counselor, I encourage you, I think counselors should spend a lot of time in the Gospels. And you need a lot of imagination. And you have to look at, how did Jesus deal with this leper? How did Jesus deal with this blind person? And obviously, we're not going to spit on people's eyes, although you'll be tempted to do it once in a while. But we're probably not going to do that. But we need to capture, like, okay, what if I live that out today? What does that look like? And to me, counseling is storytelling. It's telling the story of Jesus. Because when somebody comes and sits with you one-on-one in your office or at a Starbucks or wherever you're going to do your pastoral counseling, you have a chance to tell the story of God. Not just by what you say about opening the Bible, but by your very attitude toward them. By the very relationship that we'll talk about in a minute that you offer them. You're proclaiming who Jesus is. You're saying these stories are true. And this is how I'm living them 2,000 years later. The last part, I won't get into that a lot. Culture of maturity. The contrast to the happiness-oriented culture of the world is that really in the Bible, God's interested in maturity. He's interested in wisdom. He's interested in faith. And sometimes the way God builds faith is He takes us into the desert, takes us into tough times. How He builds maturity. I mean, even Hebrews says that, right? That consider hardship as disciplined. He says God disciplines us because He loves us. He's actually trying to shape. Look at a few verses. Galatians 4:9. These are all great spiritual formation kind of passages. Galatians, what time did we start? Okay. 4:19. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. See, that's one of God's goals, is I want to form Christ in you. Ephesians 3, I'll read that one later. Philippians 1, 9 and 10. This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best, and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, through the glory and praise of God. So many passages. 2 Corinthians 4. 2 Corinthians 4, 16 and 17. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And we could go on and on with all the scriptures. But the point is that, God is trying to shape Christ in us. He's trying to lead us into more maturity, more wisdom, more knowledge, more insight. And so I think that's part of both the person who's going through a difficult time, like a depression, like a chronic illness, like an anxiety disorder, and the one helping. We have to keep that in mind, that God's trying to work on the deeper parts of us. And if you try to help people, He's going to work on every part of you. The impatient part of you. The part of you that needs to be the hero. You're going to counsel people. You go, man, I've done all I know how to do. I'm giving them my best advice. And they're really trying, but they're still stuck. And you realize, like, wow, I'm very inept, aren't I? I mean, that's the role of a counselor. I mean, there's times you get to feel like the hero. Somebody goes, oh, you're so helpful. That one session changed my life. You're like, yes, I'm pretty good. And then there's other times you're like, have I helped a single human being in my whole life? Because you had a string of 5 appointments and you're like, man, those all went bad. Or at least just, I don't know, they're stuck. And God's working on my character, but He's also working on theirs. And so I think we have to have that perspective. Next slide, yeah. All right, go ahead and hit all of them. All right, stop there. Okay, so I said that we need a biblically sound model. Talk a little bit about that. So just the idea of a bigger perspective of how you think about what you're doing. Don't give away your birthright. It pains me to see people abandon and put in the back burner biblical knowledge, really thinking through the Bible, not as proof text, but really getting the message, the story of God, the story of His people, for technical counseling. You need to integrate the two. So anyway, but the scientifically sound model, I definitely think our model can't, we can't just pull it out of thin air. As you think about who people are, how their problems arise, how to help them, here's some obstacles that I would say to really having a sound, scientifically model. One is over-identification. Every novice counselor makes that mistake. oh, I know exactly what you're going through. No, you probably don't. Because you're one person. And so your experience matters. You need to bring it to the table with great humility, realizing, well, that's just my experience. And when you over-identify with somebody, you assume like, well, I was molested as a child, so I know exactly what you're going through. Well, actually, you don't. Yeah. Because having counseled dozens or close to 100 people or more that have been sexually abused, I found them to be very different based on a lot of things. Based on what was their family structure? How much support did they have in the family? What was the nature of the abuse? Was it ongoing? Was it one time? What's their particular temperament that maybe they were even born with? Those are all factors. So you might relate, but be careful not to over-identify, because that will limit you having a good model. A second thing is overgeneralization. Well, I once helped a person who did this. Okay, one case, scientifically means you need proof. There was a quote in a book that I read when I was in graduate school, and it said, "In God we trust, all others must have data." I love that. God we trust. He doesn't need data. He's God. Everybody else, you better have some data. You better be able to back up what you say. You say this treatment works? Where's the evidence? Is there any studies that prove that? And whether it's medication, whether it's counseling, we need to be humble again that, one person, two people, anecdotal. You can find case studies that everything in the sun works. I mean, eating the leaves off those bushes will probably cure autism. If all I have to do is find one person, I can prove it. Now, if I have to find 100 people, now I'm going to have a problem, because 100 people eating bushes, it's not going to cure their autism. So the point is, don't overgeneralize from just one case. Cultural trends and fads, again, the field of counseling has tons of them, and you have to be careful about that. Don't jump on the latest thing where everybody's depressed, everybody has ADHD, everybody has an attachment disorder. Those are fads. And there's not one diagnosis or one. I had a friend, she was a counselor, and her view of everybody, anybody who walked in her office, they were going to walk out and she would have found some trauma that was the cause of all of their problems. I was like, trauma is very real. Trauma affects people profoundly, but trauma is not the model to explain all human behavior. People are a little more complex than that. The last one is just simplistic models. One of the most simplistic models when you look for one explanation for everything. And in the model I explain in a minute that I use, I think will explain it further. Right now, I would say one of the most prevalent simplistic models is the medical model. I'm not a big fan of the medical model because it's simplistic. It's the idea that you are your biology. You are your genetics. You're depressed, there's a chemical imbalance in your brain. No scientists that actually do research believe that anymore. I think it's way more complicated than that. To think you're depressed because you don't have enough serotonin, way too simplistic. It's a much more complicated relationship between brain, environment, and it's a two-way street, and I'll explain that in a minute. So simplistic models. I remember once a brother, a good friend of mine, a guy I respect a lot, but he got up and he did a lesson, and somewhere in his lesson he said, "It's my conviction after my study that all depression at some level, at some root level, comes from sin." That got my attention. I was like, wow. But I really was like, wow, after his study, I wonder what he's been reading. This is fascinating. So I went and talked to him after sermon, and I said, "Could we talk?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "So I'd like to know where you came up with that conclusion." He's like, "Well, it's just been my observation." Like, your observation? What are you talking about? You're going to throw out all this science? But, he was just armchair speculation. He was just like, well, sitting from where I am, it just seems like that's a reasonable thing. That doesn't get you very far, So, there needs to be scientifically sound. Next slide. Okay, this is a model I started using years ago when I was first in practice. I don't know if y'all covered this. Mike told me he stole this from me, so I don't know if he presented it this time. But I didn't invent it, really. The biopsychosocial model is very popular. It is the dominant model in medicine and in psychology today. The biopsychosocial spiritual model, obviously, would be the Christian adaptation of that. And real simply, I won't get into a lot about it, but it's just the idea that any problem. So this is a scientifically and I think a biblically sound model. If I had more time, I would develop the biblical side of it. The Bible has a lot to say about our flesh, that we have flesh. And when the Bible talks about flesh, particularly if you look it up in the New American Standard Version, you'll see that biology is included, like being tired or body decaying. You'll find that emotions are covered. This flesh of ours had no rest. We were despairing. We were pressed from every side, conflicts within, pressures from without. And so there's the whole psychosocial, outside pressure, inside distress. So we definitely are not just spiritual beings. We're not just little souls floating around. And that's why some models I actually don't like very much. Like I'm not a big fan of Jay Adams, Competent to Counsel, because he has such a simplistic model. He approaches everything from a bio-spiritual model. Like you're either biology, like you're schizophrenic, okay, that's biological. Everything else is sin. It's like, wow, come on, man. People are a little bit more complicated than that. I would say that any problem a person has probably has part biology, part psychology, part social influences, and part spiritual. Biological is easy, right? Genetic influences. There's a lot of genetic stuff. As the genome project advances, there's a lot of biology involved. There's some stuff that'll freak you out. Do you know that actually the twin studies for religiousness are pretty convincing? That monozygotic twins are much more likely to have the same religious practices in their older years than dizygotic twins. Monozygotic are identical twins. Dizygotic are not identical twins. What do you think about that? Interesting, right? Now, does that mean, spirituality is genetic? Well, no, because that's still a small portion of all of spirituality. But the biological influences affect a lot of who we are, our personality. And so, if somebody's depressed, there's probably always a piece of it that's biological. It doesn't necessarily mean they need medication, but there's always a piece because not everybody who goes through the same stress gets equally depressed. So there's biology, genetics. There's also other biological things like dietary things, which gets into the social as well. Obviously, birth influences. People go through the birth canal, anoxia, lack oxygen or something. That can affect their brain development, which in turn, head injuries. If you've ever known somebody who had a dramatic head injury, their personality changed dramatically. And so may have some of their spiritual behaviors. They're more impulsive. They're more irritable. It's a brain injury, definitely in the biological realm. Psychological, that's where, the whole psychological realm. Trauma, your own personality, your learning experiences, things that happen to you through the course of your life. People who have phobias typically have experiences early in their life that sensitize them to become more fearful. And so that would be the psychological. The social, which would be your cultural context. Family culture, subculture, greater culture, American, 21st century, all of those social influences. And finally, we are spiritual beings, and that's the most important part of us, obviously. Now, I used to say that was the only eternal part of us, but I don't know. If you read the Bible, I think all of it's probably eternal. It's just going to be, anyway, that gets into a whole other study. But that our bodies will be resurrected, right? And they will be transformed. So, but the spiritual is obviously the most important part of who we are. But these all interact with one another. So, why is this important? Well, when you sit with somebody, you'll be listening for a little bit of all of those. And you'll also resist the temptation to be too simplistic. You're sitting with somebody who has an anxiety disorder. You'll resist just throwing a few scriptures on, be very courageous, do not be afraid, do not look to the left or right. Great scripture, and it has its place in helping them. But you probably want to kind of figure out, well, when their anxiety first started, you were anxious as a 5-year-old. I don't think it's because you were unspiritual at 5 that you developed anxiety, right? And so it just helps us have more compassion, more wisdom. The simplest example I can use of this would be like obesity. Obesity would be a good example. It's not just a spiritual thing. Now, there's spiritual pieces, right? The Bible talks about gluttony. The Bible talks about self-control. So there can be a part of obesity that clearly is spiritual. Not taking care of one's body, eating garbage, not exercising, not all those. And so, but there's also a social part, right? I mean, if you grew up in a family where, everything was like, let's fry it, let's put sugar on top. That's how we eat broccoli. We fry it, put a lot of cheese on it, And also that's how we celebrate. That's how we mourn. Oh, it's really sad. Let's eat. What a great occasion. Let's eat. You're graduating. Let's eat. You're getting baptized. Let's eat. You know, it's like, if that's your family environment, you know, you kind of got trained and conditioned to turn to food for comfort, for emotions, for release. Then there's the psychological part, right? You work with obesity long enough and you'll see people who it's very clear. For some people, that's a huge part. Maybe they're an incest survivor and they hate their body. It runs deep. And so they don't want to be a sexual being. And part of food is how they keep their body non-sexual. And until they tune into that, they can try every weight loss program under the sun, and they can try to repent every day. They're probably not going to change. And then there's a biological. There is just no doubt about it. We all have different set points. You know, I mean, I use myself as an example. I mean, I actually am one of those people that heavy people hate. You know, I mean, I can eat 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day and not gain a pound. I used to eat half a gallon of ice cream every 2 days. That was just my midnight snack. Now I repented of that because my cholesterol is kind of going up. There's some gluttony involved there. But the point is my biology helps me a lot. And it's not, so it's obviously not just spiritual. It's not like as I'm indulging in all that ice cream, but I'm doing it in a spiritual, thankful way. And that's why I don't get fat. You get fat because you must be eating it in an unspiritual way, even though you eat a tenth of what I eat. So that's a simple explanation of that model. But that's actually one of the easier ones. But things get more complicated from there because there's all these interactions. Like for instance, you'll have something that's very biological, obsessive compulsive disorder. That's a pretty biological thing. There's definitely a strong family history, strong genetic piece to it. It's not 100% genetic. There's definitely a learning piece too. And we know that imbalances in the serotonin system are part of it. That's why drugs like Prozac work. But one study that was done by a guy named Schwartz was a very interesting study. He compared behavior therapy, which is kind of more the therapy that I do, to medication. He just wanted to see which one worked. And what he found was, you know, they actually both work, but equally effectively. Behavior therapy has a lower relapse rate, so that's a good thing. Whereas medication, when you go off of them, the problem comes back. But his surprise was he also did biological assays. And what he found was that behavior therapy, even though you never actually gave the person a medication, it changed the chemistry of their brain. When people change their behavior and their thoughts, their chemistry changed. So now we have an arrow going from psychosocial back to biological. So again, it all gets pretty complicated, right? I already gave you the example. Psychological things can affect the spiritual. There's studies that show that your attachment style can predict how quickly you'll become a Christian. People who become Christians very rapidly usually are either avoidantly attached or anxiously attached. People who are securely attached typically it just takes them longer to become Christians, less dramatic. Isn't that interesting? Now, we'll all become Christians, praise God. You know, it's like it doesn't determine whether you're a Christian or not. But an early experience with how you bonded with your parents predicts how you'll become a Christian. It also predicts what kind of prayer you pray. That's interesting. Highly anxiously attached people have petitionary prayers. They pray a lot for, God give me this, God do this, God answer this prayer. Avoidant people who are kind of afraid of intimacy, rarely have meditative prayers. Rarely have conversational prayers with God. Because they're not comfortable with intimacy. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that even your psychology affects your spirituality. So all of these interact with one another. So this is the model that I use. So anytime you're talking to somebody, you don't have to be a trained professional to look for some of those. You look for family history. Wow, you seem to really be down in the dumps. I mean, any family members also suffer with this? Oh, wow. You've had 5 family members commit suicide. Yeah, that's a pretty big red flag for suicide, by the way. But, you know, you kind of go, there might be some biological here. So do you suddenly have to know what to do with that? Not necessarily. But isn't your advice and your counsel going to come from a pretty different place? Because suddenly you're humble. Suddenly you're more compassionate. You go, wow, I actually don't know. A good example would be helping somebody who struggles with homosexuality. There are biological pieces to homosexual attraction. There's just no doubt about it. It's not really negotiable. The more you have, the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are to struggle with homosexuality as a male. your finger length. Everybody's going to start looking at their fingers. If your ring fingers are longer, you're more likely to struggle with homosexuality. There's like, what does that have to do with sexuality? Well, see, they're biological markers. But does that mean it's all biological? Well, of course not. Actually, even the hardline scientists who are looking for a genetic basis for sexuality have concluded we will never find a gene or a set of genes for homosexuality. Because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of genes interacting, and there's environment, and there's learned, there's all of this stuff. And so really the model I use with that is I feel like people are born with some kind of predisposition, not maybe toward homosexual behavior, maybe it's toward sensitivity, maybe it's toward, some non-gender conforming by our societal standards tendencies. Then they enter very quickly into a psychosocial reality, or maybe they don't fit in so well. And so very early they start experiencing a lot of rejection. Maybe dad doesn't know what to do with his very sensitive little boy. And so he starts experiencing some rejection there. Then you get to the playground and you start experiencing more of that. More so in the South, even where it's, you got to be a jock. And so suddenly all of this is starting to play together. And then by the time they hit puberty, when it's normal to develop a sexual attraction to the mysterious sex, which is usually the opposite sex, well, if you've been rejected a lot in your early years, you're going to be attracted to the people of your same sex, because that's the mysterious one. Actually, you get along quite well with people of the opposite sex. If you're a girl, very tomboyish, get along great with the guys. And a guy, very sensitive, gets along great with the girls. It's men that are the mysterious sex. So anyway, this is not a class on homosexuality, but why is that important? When you sit with somebody, a lot of these scriptures are going to start coming to life. What did it say about the creation? What did it say about the children of God? We're also groaning, waiting for the redemption. You see, we're waiting for all this biological stuff that has to do with the fall of man and what our sin brought upon the planet. I mean, our sin has cosmic consequences. See, it's not individualistic. It's not like, well, my sin just affects me. No, it doesn't. We've brought the whole planet down with us. It's groaning. It's vomiting us out, is what the Bible says. The land is vomiting. We brought the whole thing down. Is that motivation to deal with your sin? You see, too often I think we stay so small. Bro, you need to be pure because you should. That's really compelling. But when you start thinking about the grand plan God has for a holy community, see, that's more compelling. And that, wow, the celestial beings are looking down on us. Well, that's more compelling. And that, wow, this creation is not a throwaway creation. We're not throwing these bodies away. They're going to be redeemed, transformed, and we're going to follow the firstborn of the resurrection, Jesus. Wow, that's a little bit more compelling. Maybe I should deal with these sexual urges in a righteous way, right? Anyway, I don't know how I got into that. But anyway, so scriptures come to life, but also as you help the brother or sister who struggles with homosexuality, man, your compassion is going to be, let's see, now all the scriptures about Jesus' compassion. He was harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. See, you will approach them with a very different mindset. Now, you'll still share the same scriptures. No, I'm sorry. I don't care how strong the urge is and how early it started in your life. The Bible's pretty clear on this. This is not really negotiable. But see, you're not going to be thumping them over the head with the Bible. You're going to have no idea what it feels to go through your experience. I do know this is not changeable. But I'll walk with you. I will be a faithful brother. There'll be no homophobia coming from me. I won't be afraid to hug you. I won't be blasting you in my sermons, because really most of the audience is not struggling with that. I'll talk more about pride than I talk about homosexuality in my sermon illustrations. See, you can do all that. So you're holding up the standard. We're not going to go to the gay rights end where, well, you're just made that way. No. You know, there's a lot of things that have biological underpinnings. Alcoholism. That we can't just say, but they're okay, right? Same with that. But anyway, but that model will help you. And I'm way off track. Okay, keep going. Next. All right. So I'm somewhere in the dive. I don't know where I am. Well, I'll hit the water and figure out if I completed what I wanted to complete. Give me an end time for this session, Douglas. 10:30, excellent. So this is a useful model. It's more of a psychological model, but if you mix it with the one we just talked about, this can really help you as you help people. It's a very simple model. Most of the time when people come to you and they have problems, it's at the behavior, action level, or at the emotion, feeling level. Their feelings are overwrought. They're really feeling a lot, and that's why they come: depression, anxiety, anger, frustration, stress, despair, fear. Or their behavior's getting them into trouble, acting out, getting in fights, getting in arguments, not getting along with their spouse, compulsively going to the internet, all that kind of stuff. So how do you think about that? This is a very simple model that served me well. I didn't invent it by any means, but it served me well in my training. It's just that, you know what? In life, situations are events. And an event can be anything: a conversation, you witness something, you have a flow of thought going through your mind, whatever. Any event. Events cause certain thoughts. We're always thinking. We're always processing. Some of our thoughts we're not even aware of. They happen so quickly. This is a pretty incredible thing God gave us, this brain. Somebody mentioned that. And those thoughts are what trigger the emotions. See, a lot of people think it's what happened. When that sister did this to me, it made me so angry. Well, technically, what that sister did didn't cause any feelings. It was your interpretation, your reaction. Well, why is that important? Not to beat them with that, no, that's not where I'm going, but that there's actually something very powerful. I may not be able to change the event. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you go to your sister, you go, "Hey, that really hurt my feelings." She goes, "Wow, I had no idea, I'm so sorry." Sometimes she goes, "Oh, stop being a baby and stop whining." You know, like, "Whoa, that was really helpful." And so sometimes you can't change the situation, but you can change your thoughts. And that's a lot of what you're doing in counseling. You're trying to take thoughts captive, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So now we're talking Bible. You know, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Now we're trying to take these thoughts and conform them, put them in a bigger framework that we talked about earlier, so that then they can cope with whatever the event was. Because that's where most of our emotions are going to come from. Now, this model's simple. There's some other pieces you have to plug in, but it holds pretty well. And so, sometimes you back up to your thoughts. Well, let me give you an analogy. In a car, you have a little red light, right? Red light that goes on if there's an engine problem. The red light's like the emotions. It goes, "Warning, warning, something's going on. I'm angry, I'm hurt, I'm fearful, I'm frustrated." Red light goes on. And so, just like a car, your emotions are a signal. They tell you, "Hey, do something." And so you have to figure out, either something's wrong with the car, and that red light's giving me a very important signal, and I need to take action. Which in that case means, no, my situation's okay. Thoughts are fine, pretty reasonable, pretty rational, pretty spiritual thoughts. My emotions, therefore, are understandable, and so I just need to figure out what action to take. Now I need to make sure it's a righteous action. In your anger, do not sin, for instance, right? So I need to take appropriate action. But sometimes the warning light is just, you take it to the shop, they go, "Oh, there's nothing wrong. It's just, I don't know, some weird wire, or just a weird factory thing. Well, reset it. But your engine's fine." Well, sometimes our emotions are flashing, and there really is no action to be taken. There actually is nothing I need to do. I need to back up and look at my thoughts, go, "Oh, okay, I was just thinking about it wrong." If I use a very simplistic, bad example, or it's not a bad example, it's just very simplistic. Somebody walks in my office, and they go, they walk into the room and they kind of go, see a picture of my family, go, "Wow, your kids are some ugly, some kind of ugly." I wouldn't have a picture up if I were you. So, situation, rude patient comes in and makes comment about my children. Let's say it's not a client, because then you could understand, they're resistant to therapy, they're trying to push me away so I can't help them, but I won't fall for that trap. No. Let's say instead it's in my house. It's my neighbor who came over. They're not a client. And so, situation, rude neighbor comes in, insults my family. Thoughts, what a rude neighbor. I'd like to take his head off. Have you looked in the mirror, buddy, lately? Emotions, anger, maybe a little bit of rage, anger, confusion, action. Aha, well see, in that case, is it normal that I would be angry? Well, yeah, I mean, come on, buddy. But action. See, now in that case, I just need to decide what's the appropriate spiritual action. So I might say, this is kind of one of the first times we've met. I think we're off to a rough start here. We're going to have a hard time having a great friendship if you just kind of come in and start insulting my family. I'd rather you insult me. So, I'm not too keen on this. So there's the door. If you'd like to come back and be nicer, I'd be love to have you over again. See, that would be an appropriate action, right? I was assertive. I gave him some feedback. But I didn't, in my anger, I didn't sin. Let's say same situation. Somebody walks in, let's say this time they walk into my counseling office, and they go, wow, my office, the walls are green. It's a very soothing, peaceful green. I forget what it's called. Heather green, I don't know. Anyway, so they walk in and go, wow, this is green. And that's all they say. So my thoughts are, they don't like green. They think my office is ugly. They probably think I'm not a good therapist. I bet they said that just to get to me. I bet they're really doubting if I'll be able to help them. And suddenly I'm angry. I can't believe you insulted my office. And me, and my pride, and my very being, and my degree. And you probably hate LSU too. And so, in that case, the red light is going off. I'm having feelings, I'm angry. But what action should I take? Confront them on saying my office is green? I could. But I probably need to back up and go, whoa, hold on here. We jumped to some major conclusions here. All he said was, this is green. He might be thinking, I love this color. I'd like to put it in my kitchen. He might be thinking like, that's interesting. I wonder why therapists would pick green. I wonder if it's a soothing color. Maybe he's thinking that. Or maybe he's thinking, I don't particularly care for green, but I guess he likes it. He could be thinking any of those things. So it's my thoughts that are. So that's a very simplistic thing. But as you help people, you can help them sort some of this out.
That's good.
Well, they have a lot of feelings like, okay, well, is it the action that needs to be taken? Let's make sure it's a spiritual, a godly, and an adaptive action. An action that actually helps the problem, doesn't make it worse. Or is it like, well, maybe some of their thoughts are askew. So anyway, that's a simple model. Next slide. Okay, I want to try to get through most of this before the break. So in the break, we'll talk about the example. Okay, healthy relationship. I would say relationship is one of the most important things of counseling. I'd rather have somebody, and Carl Rogers, that was his whole thing, obviously. The existential school of counseling, the human-centered school of counseling. There's actually tons of counselors trained in that model. That was probably the most popular model among Christian counselors. But basically, it would say that relationship is the central part of counseling. That specific techniques are less important. I wouldn't totally agree with that techniques aren't important and that knowledge and knowing isn't important. But if you have to pick one, this is the one I'd pick. I'd pick relationship over everything else. Because relationship, just hit the two more times. I just want to talk about 3 quick qualities of Christ that I think have relevance to the counselor, pastoral counselor. Humility of Christ. Obviously, you know the scripture, Matthew 11:28. Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. For my burden is light, my yoke is easy. For I'm gentle and humble in heart. Very interesting that Jesus chose those 2 descriptors to describe himself when he was thinking about helping people who are weary and burdened. It's his humility and his gentleness. And if you want to go into the kind of more pastoral counseling area, you got to embrace that. That if you're going to err in a direction, don't err in the direction of corrective rebuke. Err in the direction of gentle humility. There's a place for rebuke, absolutely, but in the context of humility and gentleness. If you don't know the difference between a rebuke that comes from a humble person versus a proud person, then you've just never seen it. But it's pretty obvious. And the same with gentleness. You can be very corrective but gentle. And I think that's a quality that's so essential. And humility, what does it do to you? As we already mentioned, humility helps you understand that the situation may not be as simple as you thought coming into it. Some of you are already gathering that after 3 days of learning about people. I think humility will make you a passionate listener. There's a quote by Paul Tournier. I love Paul Tournier in the reference list. Are we going to be able to get this to people at some point, do you think? Or yeah, okay. So you'll have a reference list. But Paul Tournier was a Swiss doctor who was trained as a general practitioner, and he was a pretty cold, aloof kind of person, a good part of his practice. But at some point, he really, became a Christian, and this was the early 1900s in Switzerland, and it totally changed his view. And he really became a counselor, a Christian counselor. He said, I have no training, I'm just a doctor, I'm not a therapist, not a psychoanalyst. But he's written some great books. But he has a quote that I love. He says, the essential part of psychotherapy is listening. Long and passionate listening with a sincere desire to understand. I love that quote because it's totally true. You know the scriptures, Proverbs 18. We could do a whole workshop. If you want to be a better counselor in your ministries, I really encourage you, do some listening workshops. There's tons of, I can send you exercises. But it's easy to come up with the scriptures, go through some scriptures together, discuss them, then do 2 or 3 listening exercises, a 1 or 2 3-hour workshop. I think churches should do them every year, every couple of years. It changes. Everybody thinks they're better listeners than they are. You really. Everybody thinks, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at listening. No, you're not. It's something we have to keep working on because it takes so much. But Proverbs 18, verse 13. He who answers before listening, that is his folly and his shame. So somebody comes up to you and say, hey bro, this is the problem in my life. What should I do? He who answers before listening, that is his folly and his shame. You can give him a foolish answer if you want to. But you probably should say, wow, we probably need to sit down and talk for a while. So then you have to decide if you have the time to do it. You may not. But you're not going to serve them very well by giving them a quick answer. Look what it says in verse 15. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. The ears of the wise seek it out. The ears of the wise seek out knowledge. They're tuned into, they're listening, they're trying to understand. The passage in Isaiah 50, verse 4, I shared this in a number of settings, but when I was was finishing my PhD, I loved this verse. I had this secret fantasy of grandiosity that when I was buried, they would put this on my gravestone, this great scripture. That was pretty grandiose, I know. The sovereign Lord has given me an instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. It's like, wow, that'd be great to have on my gravestone. And then later I noticed, wait, there's a part B. Part B is he wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being taught. He said, if you want to know the words to sustain the weary, part A is you got to wake up in the morning with an attitude of listening. Listening to God. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Right? Hebrews 3, Hebrews 4. But also, listen to others. And we're so busy. We're in a culture of talkers. I'm a talker by nature. I really am. And it's been good work for me for 20 years to have to listen to people 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But it's amazing that if you listen long enough, I think even people with very little training, if they have a sincere desire to understand, eventually patterns start emerging. And the more you do it, the wiser you get. So I feel like listening is it's a mark of the humility of Christ, but it's so essential. The last scripture would be Luke 2, 46 and 47, when Jesus is in the temple. If you go back and read that scripture, very interesting, because they're amazed at his answers. But what it says is he actually sat, listened, and asked questions. It's very interesting, is that he actually is there listening to them. I'll just read it. 46. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. He first listened and asked questions even at 12 years old. And based on what he was hearing and listening to, and the questions he was getting answers to, then he could speak with wisdom. And that's very true in counseling. If you've really listened and understood a person, then whatever feedback you give will be very helpful. Compassion of Christ. Obviously, in the field of counseling, empathy is always considered one of the most important qualities of a counselor, a good counselor. And there have been studies done who are effective counselors, who are ineffective counselors. Counselors that rate high in empathy are usually are among the best counselors. Empathy is the ability to feel with, feel for somebody else. Biblically, probably the word we'd see the most often would be compassion. Jesus was compassion. Luke 7 is the passage where there's the widow who's leaving town, bearing her son, and he's coming into town with his entourage. She has her entourage. And it says his heart went out to her. And he goes and heals her son. It's just a great picture. And the people go, today God has heard his people. Come to, they praise God because God has come. He's heard his people's cry. He's come to heal them. And so that's Jesus. Matthew 9:36, he saw the crowds. And he saw them as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. I love that picture because, it's the same people that try to kill him, try to throw him off cliffs, ultimately crucify him. His view of them is they're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He saw that sin entraps people. It makes them ugly, but he saw past that. And I think that's so important because people come in with all kinds of problems. Out of control sexual behavior, hopeless addiction, just intense conflict interpersonally. And we got to talk about the sin, absolutely. But we want to keep that compassion. Like, wow, how did this person get here? Because if you can't get past your contempt, you will never help them. You might help them for a minute. You say something really hard and they go, wow, that was helpful. But it's not going to last, trust me. And if you really want to help them, you got to get past that judgmentalness, that contempt, and really be able to have compassion. For me, early, I feel like God has really been good. And he's good to all of us. He puts us in situations to train us, to form us. Early on, I was like a 24, 25-year-old in training. I had several clients that were intense. I had one client came in who was a pedophile. And, he'd gone to jail. He'd really been a pedophile. And he'd become a Christian. And he just struggled with the impulses. He wasn't acting out at all anymore. And I was like, wow, this is intense. And so as I sat and listened to him, if I was going to help him, I had to take the approach of, okay, he got to be this way somehow. He has no clue. He really didn't. He was one of the least insightful people I'd ever met up until that point. And to this day, he's still in the top 10. But he just had very little insight. And so he wasn't going to figure it out on his own. He really needed somebody who would sit with him and start pulling apart. Like, how did you get there? And so that was a challenge for me because I'd always thought, I knew that existed and that people needed help. I just didn't think they'd walk in my office. And so over the years, I've worked with quite a few people. And I bring that up as an extreme example because you have to have compassion to help somebody. And I think Jesus obviously is a great example of that. There's a lot of pieces to that. The next part is the respect of Christ. John 15:15, I've called you friends. I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends because I've shared everything with you. That's one scripture, but that's a pervasive attitude of Christ. The respect he showed his disciples, the knucklehead turkeys that keep arguing about the same things over and over. And he sighed at times and looked up to heaven like, how long will I put up with you? Do you still have no faith? He definitely, had his moments of frustration with them. But yet he still sent them out, the 12. He left the church in their hands. So you see consistently that Jesus had great respect for people. And as a counselor, you have to have respect for people. You have to trust that there is a part of them somewhere that wants to change. Yeah. And they have the capacity within themselves and God, we're not humanists, but to change. If they're my brother in Christ or my sister in Christ, they do have the Holy Spirit in them. And so I need to treat them with that kind of respect. And also, I want to help them tap into a motivation that can last. I want them to be motivated to do it from within, from their relationship with God, not just depend on me. So anyway, that would be the thoughts I would have about relationship. Again, we could do a lot more on that. Last part, and we'll wrap up. Self-awareness. Next slide.